Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing really well. I'm doing fabulous, thank you very much, and so much love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're keeping yourself lovely and cool with the hot weather out there, or if you are living in a cold climate, that you're keeping yourself lovely and warm. So whatever it is that you fancy drinking, like an Irish coffee or something very cooling and refreshing, go and get it, because I've got a lovely story for you tonight, a story that's going to warm the cockles of your heart. And let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, a little boy of about 10 years old darted out of the farmhouse. He had heard the sound of the truck roaring down the drive at one hell of a speed. The crunching noise of pebbles beneath heavy rubber tyres, the thump of something hitting the ground very hard. The sound no driver ever wants to hear, for you instinctively know that you have hit something. He could hear the truck grind to a very swift, jerking halt, the driver's side door slamming behind him, a man's deep, raspy voice saying, "Bloody hell! What the heck?" The willowy figure of the elderly man, with his thick thatch of white hair, his full white beard, was bending down over the ground to examine the carnage, his weathered face full of regret, remorse. A hint of shame could be discerned in his cornflower blue eyes. He knew he should not have speeded down the drive like that. What was he thinking? He was just visiting his sister, for goodness sake, not competing in a trucker's marathon. He shuddered with horror, knowing the full ramifications of his grisly, unacceptable crime, one of which would not be easily forgiven, for this was Spencer's pet rabbit, a beloved member of the Metcalf family. The little boy's face had grown pale, his earnest hazel eyes as large as saucers. He ran up to where the old man was crouching above the ground, hovering above something like a vulture over a recently killed carcass. He could see that his white rabbit that his grandmother had brought him was now dead. Tears poured down his dust-covered face, leaving behind white trails. "You killed my rabbit, Uncle Joe! You're a murderer! How could you? If you hadn't driven down the drive so fast, Snowdrop would have got away in time. You killed my bunny." The boy's look was distraught. His big hazel eyes were clouded by his tears. Some of the droplets glistened like raindrops on his dark lashes. He sat down on the ground next to the remains of the rabbit, hoping beyond hope for a miracle. "What happened?" came his grandmother's voice. She rushed out of the house as quickly as she could, clouds of flour sweeping up into her face. She wiped her washed hands onto her apron. Her face was indignant, disapproving, when she saw the sorry sight of the dead rabbit, along with a devastated look on her grandson's face. It was a look she never ever wanted to see. A look of helplessness, despair, disappointment, grief. Oh, how she wished she could make things better for him by turning back the hands of time. But Snowdrop was now dead. What was done could not be undone. "How could you, Joe Metcalf?" she said, slapping her brother with a feisty hand. "Look what you've done! How many times have I told you not to drive like an imbecile down our drive? You've broken Spencer's heart. I hope you feel pleased with yourself." "Spencer, I'm really sorry," said Great-Uncle Joe, looking at the boy apologetically, feeling a sense of self-loathing in his gut. "I'll get you another bunny. I promise you that." The little boy looked up at Uncle Joe with horror. "But I don't want another rabbit, Uncle Joe. I want Snowdrop." Why could his great-uncle not understand that Snowdrop could never be replaced? Never, ever. He was the best rabbit in the world. Didn't Uncle Joe understand that? You couldn't replace him. It was impossible. Of course, there had been a funeral service for Snowdrop. It was his grandmother's great suggestion. He was buried beneath the old oak tree in the front yard, close to where he'd met his unfortunate end. Grandmother had said he would be able to watch over them if he was buried there. The boy liked the thought of that. It brought him a measure of comfort and reassurance. Uncle Joe had attended the service, looking ever so slightly sheepish and rather ashamed. He spent the entire service rubbing his white moustache pensively. He did redeem himself by reading a verse of scripture for the rabbit. Then they had sung All Things Bright and Beautiful together, All Things Great and Small, while he and his grandmother scattered roses on the grave. All of a sudden Spencer had observed a large face peering out at them behind the hedgerow, but he must have imagined it, he thought. That little boy was me. I was raised by my grandparents on their farm in Idaho. My own parents were both meth addicts. They were not capable of taking care of me, so both of my grandparents had gained custody of me through the court system. My mother would visit me regularly, under my grandmother's supervision, but she scared the hell out of me. She looked like a zombie, like you see on those very scary movies, those spaced-out people with the hollow eyes, gormless grins, white faces. My grandmother had assured me she had not always looked like this when she was healthy, but it was difficult to imagine her any other way. Your mother used to be a very pretty young girl, she would tell me. When she was growing up, all the boys wanted to date her. She would open her large photo album to show me pictures of when my mother had been a young girl. I could barely recognise her. My granny was absolutely right. She was so pretty at one point in her life. It was hard to believe it was the same person. I couldn't understand why the girl with the layers of blonde hair, the lovely vibrant smile of almost perfect glistening white teeth, the soulful deep blue eyes that stared up into the camera with a vibrant enthusiasm, had morphed into one of the ugliest people I knew. Nowadays her face was covered in pink blotches along with these god-awful red spots. Her skin looked dull, weathered, even aged. Her eyes were lifeless, rather like marbles. Her teeth, well, what was left of them, were falling away from their gums. "Why doesn't Mummy look like that now?" I asked. "It's the meth," said my grandmother, looking at me very sadly. "That substance steals your soul. It hijacks your physical appearance." "But why?" I asked. "I don't know, sweetheart. Your mother cannot resist taking the drug. She knows better, but her compulsion to take it is so great. She's addicted to it, you see." "Does it taste nice?" I asked. "No, sweetheart. It makes her feel good. That's why she takes it. She can't stop herself. It's an addiction. Even though she knows it's harming her body, she takes it to feel normal. That's why you came to live with me. Your mother cannot even look after herself, so she would never be able to look after you. This meth, it makes you very sick. Will she ever get better, Granny?" "I don't know, sweetheart," said my grandmother, planting a kiss on my forehead. "We can only hope and pray. Miracles do sometimes happen." "But if miracles happen, Granny, why did Snowdrop have to die like that?" My grandmother looked at me and said, "Sometimes life can be very cruel, sweetheart. I like to think that maybe your mother can learn some valuable lessons in her life from her meth addiction. That's the only way I can cope with what she's done to herself." I had never known any other life but the rich, vibrant days I spent living with my grandparents in their rustic farmhouse. I was so glad I lived with them. In my eyes, they were my true parents. We lived in a really pretty farm in Idaho, the place where my own mother had grown up as a young girl, with aspirations of becoming a prima ballerina long behind her, dreams that would never ever be fulfilled or realized. They had been scattered to the wayside like forsaken pebbles on the road. We lived in a rural, remote area, off the beaten track, surrounded by windy dirt roads that would go on for an eternity. Roads that could leave you stranded, lost if you didn't know where you were going. Our farmhouse was as pretty as a picture, one of those beguiling alpine wooden homes that would look good enough to appear on a box of Swiss chocolates. It was situated against a backdrop of undulating mountainous hills that towered up under the sky, many of them superbly swathed in carpets of green foliage, most notably from the Douglas firs, lodgepole pines or mountain hemlocks that clustered together as they rose up this mountainous ascent. Our farmhouse was surrounded by pretty meadows, hemmed in by wooden picket fencing, where we had 2 cows grazing there, Matilda and Sunflower. I used to adore those cows. I would visit them regularly, chat to them for hours on end. They would look up at me as they chewed the grass and moo. I always felt they understood exactly what I was saying. They looked so intelligent, so discerning, so clever. Matilda was particularly affectionate. I'd often brush her with a steel comb. Boy, did she love that. If she had her way, she'd have me combing her day in and day out, but that was never ever going to happen. My grandfather had a huge black dog called Rufus. I'm not sure what kind of breed he actually was, but he was very large as the St. Bernard. He followed my grandfather around devotedly everywhere he went, lying by his side contentedly when he was reading the paper or smoking his aromatic pipe. He would accompany him on hunts, always jumping into the back of his truck on shopping trips to the local town. I could never separate Rufus from my Gramps. Try as I might, he would not even be remotely tempted to a game of ball unless my grandfather was involved. Then he would dash around the meadows, wagging his tail profusively, barking happily, and retrieving anything that you threw at him. One of my favourite spots to hang out was the woodgrove, where large clusters of lodgepole pines were gathered together like a crowd of tall people over a vast area. These trees were so majestic, magnificent, imposing. I found I was always drawn to them like old friends. I loved this tranquil, enchanted woodland sanctuary, always alive with the sound of pretty birdsong, with the strong smell of butterscotch enveloping the air. When you entered the woods, they were shaded from the heat of the midday sun. It was so cool in there, darker too, with a very subtle ethereal light that danced through the trees, twinkling onto the dark, fertile soil, covered in lacy ferns along with an abundance of very beguiling green moss that bespeckled everything, rather like the sprinkles on a fairy cake. Better still was the prettiest little stream that traversed and meandered through the woods. It gushed over the rocks with a feisty, thunderous current. Its water was so crystal clear that you could literally see the pretty rocks beneath the water, their shades of greens, reds and creamy browns, very attractive to the eye. I loved rolling up my pants, paddling in this cold water, especially on a hot day. It was so refreshing. One day as I was paddling around in the stream, picking up some of the pretty rocks in the shallow end, throwing them into the water, watching them skimming across the surface, finally sinking to the sandy depths to join the rest of the stones beneath, I suddenly sensed I wasn't alone, that something or someone was actually watching me. I looked up to study the trees, to see if anything was actually there, but I was rewarded with nothing. Then I suddenly heard a shh sound. I knew at once that someone was trying to get my attention, but who? And then I saw her. She was indicating for me to follow her with her dark fingers. I knew she was female. She had a maternal energy like my grandmother, along with a pair of floppy breasts that drooped down low on her chest. I did, without any hesitancy, doubt or reluctance on my part. I wasn't remotely scared, not even for a moment or a fleeting second, although I had no clue what or who she was. In my opinion, she was like a large bear, but she stood up tall like a man, was covered in long flowing golden brown hair, a very beguiling beautiful colour. I did notice she had a head shaped rather like a mountain gorilla, low slung on the shoulders, but her face was exactly like a human being. She was quite feminine, really, I thought. I noticed her deep-set dark eyes were animated, joyful even. There was nothing about her demeanour that made me the least bit apprehensive or uptight. On the contrary, I felt intrigued, curious, excited even. What did she want to show me, I wondered. I sensed it was something wonderful, really, really wonderful. I followed the creature. She handed me this ball of fluff. It was a tiny, cute puppy, the sweetest thing I'd ever seen, really rather reminding me of a golden retriever, only much, much tinier. She looked at my pleased expression with twinkling eyes, as if she was waiting to see my eyes light up like a Christmas tree. She was not disappointed, for they did. The creature looked over the moon, ecstatic, thrilled. She seemed to delight in putting a smile on my face. It made her feel good, really good. The little puppy nuzzled me, pressing his tiny paw against me. He smelt deliciously of puppy, that yummy puppy parsley smell that I love so much. She pointed to me, then to the puppy, indicating that she wanted me to keep it for good. I have no idea where she found the puppy, but I was thrilled with it. I ran back to my grandmother to show her the cute little mite. "What a magnificent puppy," she said. "Where did you find it?" "In the woods," I told her. I knew better than to tell her about my new friend, as my grandmother warned me regularly about the dangers of bears. I figured she'd put my new friend in the same category. I was not about to blow her cover or upset my grandmother. I thought it best to say nothing. "It's the sweetest thing I've ever seen. Who in their right mind would dump a precious little puppy like this in the woods like that? Some people are totally insane, off their trolley. I mean, anyone in their right mind would want to adopt this little darling, wouldn't they?" "Granny, can I keep it?" I asked. "Why, of course. I think the puppy was sent to you, especially after your recent tragedy in losing Snowdrop. You asked about miracles, sweetheart. This certainly is one." "Thank you, Granny," I said. "You don't know what this means to me." "Oh, I think I do, Spencer. I think I do," she said, ruffling my brown hair up into spikes so that I looked rather like a hedgehog. Looking back, I'm sure this creature had witnessed me losing my rabbit, as I remember something peering at us behind the tree during the funeral service. I was pretty sure it was her. She had gone out of her way to get me a puppy, but I've no idea where it came from. But I wasn't going to look a gift horse in the mouth, was I? Before long, me and my puppy that I called Tweed would spend our days out in the wood green with the creature I chose to call Sugar, because she had a very sweet tooth and loved all the candy bars I would bring her pretty regularly, most especially nougat filled with nuts, muesli bars, and the occasional Kit Kat. The chocolate Kit Kats were at first not a hit. She spat them out in disgust, as if they were the most revolting thing she'd ever tasted in her life. But I persuaded her to give them a second chance. Then she began to enjoy the new flavour. Perhaps chocolate is an acquired taste, I thought. I wanted to bring the creature treats because I liked her so much, so surreptitiously on a whim I'd asked my grandmother what girls actually liked. Of course she got the wrong end of the stick, thought I fancied the silly little girl called Amy at Sunday school. I didn't like that little brat one little bit. She was the most annoying kid I'd ever met. But I never told my grandmother that. She told me that ladies loved all things sugary. It seemed she wasn't wrong. So all the sweets she brought me to give Amy ended up being given to my hairy friend, who was always very appreciative. Every time I went into the woodgrove, Sugar would be there, waiting for me. She was my best-kept secret. My grandmother would ponder why I never complained any more about being bored, playing outside on my own, with the cows, free-range chickens, and my mountain bike for company. She put it down to Tweed's presence in my life. It was true, the dog was proving to be a bundle of joy, a jubilant personality. She was like a miniature golden retriever in her temperament. She loved Sugar as much as I did. Sugar used to take my hand, as if we were besties. Her hands were leathery, pinkish underneath. I would talk to her like I talked to the cows, but she really did get what I was saying, even though she didn't comprehend my language, but she appeared to really understand and read my thoughts, almost as if she was telepathic. She'd often cradle me in her arms. I would feel so tiny, protected, loved when she pulled me towards her chest like a devoted mother. She would pat my back reassuringly. I could smell the hint of butterscotch fragrance of the forest along with the salt of her own sweat in her long, flowing golden hair. She rarely made an effort to make her hair look good by brushing it with her fingers to remove the forest debris that got caught in it. I used to love her smell. Sometimes she would ferret around in my hair like a monkey looking for nits, but she did this affectionately, which meant growing up I permanently looked like a hedgehog with my hair standing up on edge. In my latter years, it became rather a cool, trendy look. One day I noticed a very sizable creature, much like Sugar, only much, much bigger, standing there in the undergrowth watching us with intense, deep-set dark eyes. He seemed fixated on us. Everywhere me and Sugar went, along with my dog, so did this annoying creature. He would stalk us stealthily, rather like a cheetah, crouching furtively in the underbrush, but the difference was we all knew very well that he was hiding in our midst. He was naturally evasive, but he wanted to be seen by Sugar. Tweed didn't like him at all. She would growl at the creature. Sugar was about 6 foot tall, but this dirty blonde creature was easily over 9 foot. He was colossal in girth, stature and weight. In truth, he was very intimidating, scary even, but I knew I was safe with Sugar, for she had my back. I could tell she didn't like this creature at all. She would roll back her thin lips, growling at him like a dog guarding its bone. The creature didn't seem to care one jot. It was completely infatuated, bedazzled, enamoured by Sugar, like an obsessed groupie besotted or captivated by a pop singer. This blonde creature tirelessly pursued Sugar without being put off by her indignant protests. In fact, the more indignant she became, the more obsessed he became. He even threw her tiny gifts like a dead squirrel, some apples, various stones, one of which was so pretty it got Sugar quite excited. I was afraid that Sugar would end up liking the creature too much, so I ended up buying her bright marbles that soon eclipsed any of the stones that the blonde creature threw at her. She disregarded them with contempt, not even showing a faint interest, showing the blonde creature my fabulously sparkling marbles, as if to say, "Your gifts are positively inferior to these glittering balls. Try and match them." The blonde creature looked disheartened, but he didn't give up in his entourage of presents he piled on her daily. I rarely felt afraid that he was going to steal my best friend away from me. He was relentless in his pursuit of Sugar, like a lovesick teenager. After a while, Sugar allowed the blonde creature to hang around us, as if slowly but surely he was beginning to worm his way into her heart. He would watch Sugar, as if he was completely and totally enamoured by her. I don't think he liked me one bit. He was jealous of the affection Sugar lavished on me. He saw it as a threat. When Sugar wasn't looking, he growled at me quite ferociously. But when I told Sugar what he'd done through my reenactments, she chased after him, screaming blue murder at him, oscillating her arms wildly. She was as mad as hell. I was so glad. I thought we'd finally seen the back of the blonde creature. But there he was again, like a proverbial bad smell that just wouldn't leave. He began to even bring me gifts, not because he liked me at all, but he knew such a kindness would soften Sugar's heart. It certainly did. I began to notice Sugar's belly swell. I wanted to believe it was the sweets I'd given her and that she'd just put on weight, but in my gut I knew she was pregnant. The belly began to get bigger and bigger and bigger every day. It wasn't hard to figure out who the father was. One day when I went into the woodgrove, there she was standing next to the blonde creature, as though they were a couple. The expression on her face was terribly sad. She pointed to her belly, then to the blonde creature, then to the distance. She was moving away, going to live with the blonde creature to raise a family. I was not sure that I'd ever see her again. I was crestfallen, downcast, gutted. Tears poured down my face. Sugar looked alarmed. She took me into her arms, wiping away my tears with her hands, rocking me backwards and forwards for ages. She stared deeply into my eyes, cupping the corner of my face with her hands. Even the blonde creature seemed more compassionate, empathetic and understanding. He moved towards me, patted my back gently, grunting. I was amazed that Sugar and the blonde creature were speaking to each other in a strange language, incorporating lots of clicks, reminding me of the language spoken by the First Nations people. I knew they were talking about me. I felt as if she was saying she'd come back to visit me. The blonde creature nodded encouragingly to affirm this fact. Then they were gone, moving so gracefully like the wind. I remember my heart was broken. I was inconsolable with grief. My grandmother had no comprehension what was wrong with me. I think she thought that Amy had rejected me, finally dumping me. She kept telling me that Amy was not the only girl in the world. She was sure I'd meet someone else I liked. It must have been 5 long years that went by. For me it felt like an entire lifetime. I'd given up all hope in seeing Sugar again. The grief hung in my heart like silken cobwebs, too tough to dust away. I didn't want to think about Sugar too much. It really hurt. She was the finest friend I'd ever known. So non-judgmental, so accepting, so completely loving. Life was a lot less rich, magical or pleasurable without her around. She always knew how to bring a smile to my face or comfort me when I was sad. One morning when I was riding my bicycle down a remote country road, Tweed was getting all flustered and excited about something, wagging her tail profusely, as if she could smell something she really liked and was well acquainted with on the wind. Then I saw them running through the trees towards the embankment, jumping over the embankment in long jumps onto the side of the road. It was Sugar, the blonde creature, along with another creature that was about 3 foot tall, which I realised was Sugar's son. I dropped my bicycle on the side of the embankment, running towards Sugar. We couldn't stop holding each other. She rocked me backwards and forwards in her arms. She was making an ah sound as though she was so happy. She grunted with pleasure to see me. She pointed proudly to her belly and then to her son, who eyed me curiously, but appeared rather reticent, withdrawn and quiet. Yet I could tell he was rather fascinated by me and knew a lot about me. Eventually the 2 creatures left me, Sugar and Tweed, to our own devices. We spent the whole day together, swimming in the nearby creek. I talked to her for hours while she nodded as if she understood everything I said, just like old times. It was one of the most magical days of my entire life, one that leaves an indelible impression on my mind that will never ever be forgotten. That all happened about 25 long years ago. I miss Sugar dreadfully, but I'm unlikely to ever see her again, as my grandmother's farm in Idaho is now owned by other residents. My grandmother died 15 years ago. I also miss her so much. I now live with my wife and 2 kids in Philadelphia. I do take the family to visit the area, in the hope that one day I might see Sugar again. This time introduce her to my kids. I know the creature I encountered all those years ago was almost certainly a Bigfoot. It's impossible for me to think negatively about Bigfoots. Sugar was one of the most human people I've ever known. My little kid Jason said to me, "Daddy, but aren't Bigfoots supposed to be bad?" I said to him, "Son, just like people, you get good ones and bad ones. But the one Daddy knew was more human than a lot of people I know." So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. I did love the sound of Sugar. What an exceptional Bigfoot. Until next time, goodbye and good night.